what his stops will be. A lot of people really looking forward to this visit. Also, protesters wanting to make their voices heard as well.
Yeah, we do not have an official itinerary. We do understand the president has even said as much through tweets that he plans on meeting with law enforcement as well as first responders and some of the victims as well from Sunday morning's massacre. So we are going to be providing coverage here wherever the president may go. We are unsure if he is even going to speak at this point to answer any questions or make any address at this point, but we will be following that as well. Certainly, a lot of questions have been brought up over the past couple of days about whether or not the president is ready to do something. That's a phrase that we have heard quite a bit over these last couple of days.
You can see Air Force One is now on the ground at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, coming to a stop there. The president tweeting just about 6 minutes ago in honor of National Purple Heart Day, honoring all of our country's Purple Heart recipients. He was also tweeting about the situation in Dayton a few hours ago, referencing the shooter's political ideologies. Yeah. So Dayton has been referenced several times in the last few days on the president's Twitter. Of course, the day after the shooting, saying that his heart went out, and also speaking about the first responders who were able to stop the shooting so quickly.
Again, nothing scheduled for President Trump to answer questions. However, before he left the White House this morning on Marine One to go over to Andrews to then fly here to Dayton, President Trump did answer some questions, and we're going to bring that to you here in just a few minutes. There were some very pointed questions, and we all understand there are a lot of talking points all happening simultaneously from the grieving process that families are still going through, not just here in Dayton, but also in El Paso, as we saw over the weekend from that mass shooting in El Paso. And here in Dayton, a total of 31 people killed. So there is that about the grieving process. And Lauren, as we've seen really ramp up over these past couple of days, and it's been a talking point for years now, but certainly in these parts, it's really intensified the political conversation to this as well.
If you're just joining us right now, these are live pictures of Air Force One on the ground at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We know the president left around 9 a.m. from Andrews Air Force Base, just touched down minutes ago here in the Miami Valley. We don't know exactly what his plans are for this trip. We know he wants to meet with victims, families, and survivors, possibly law enforcement, first responders, anyone connected to this tragedy that we saw unfold Sunday morning. We are waiting now for the president to deplane. We're not sure yet exactly what he's going to be doing here at Wright-Patterson, if he will answer any questions or address the media. There is obviously a large media presence there. Dayton is really in the headlines all across the country. We have not only our local media, but national media in town as well. Yeah,
we heard from Dayton Mayor Nan Whaley yesterday about the visit of President Trump, and she says that she will, in her official capacity, welcome the President of the United States. We are also understanding that there are some other elected officials there. We're expecting to see Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, Senator Sherrod Brown, and I believe Senator Rob Portman is also here as well. So there will be those. And here's a live shot. You see Congressman Mike Turner there as well, waiting to greet the president. And Congressman Mike Turner himself making a statement yesterday. As we kind of pan the crowd there, you see Senator Sherrod Brown and Mayor Nan Whaley as well, awaiting the president right now. And I bring up Congressman Mike Turner just because yesterday the Republican congressman from the Dayton area made a statement as to his position on a very politically charged topic, and that is that of assault weapons. And that's a statement in which he came out and said that he is in support of making it illegal to possess assault weapons. And as he was talking about that, he was mentioning that such weapons are so destructive and deadly when in the wrong hands, and he called that intolerable. And keep it in mind, and the reason I bring up Congressman Turner in that is that He is a longstanding member of the Armed Services Committee. He's also a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman Turner, a man with political sway in Washington, D.C.
Also a very personal topic for him. His daughter, we found out on Sunday, later in the day Sunday, he let us know that his daughter was actually in the Oregon District when the shooting took place. Here's actually his statement. This was the statement he sent to 2 News saying, in part, quote, "I will support legislation that prevents the sale of military-style weapons to civilians, a magazine limit, and red flag legislation. The carnage these military-style weapons are able to produce when available to the wrong people is intolerable." And you heard that red flag legislation. That's something that has come up a lot. The president mentioned that during his speech there a couple days ago when he was discussing what he was planning to do in regards to gun control or any sort of legislative reform. The president speaking about specifically red flag legislation, something that would be focused on people who may show those signs that something could happen like this. The red flag is just a term that we have heard a lot about, even from Governor Mike DeWine. That was something that he spoke on yesterday as he introduced his plan for gun control, or whatever his response would be to the shooting here in Ohio. And he focused, again, very much on that red flag legislation.
And we're getting that look there of Air Force One taxiing in. Just kind of give you a heads up as to what's going to take place here. Once it's parked, it'll be a number of minutes before the president and the First Lady will be deplaning, and then the motorcade will then be in action. We do not have the exact itinerary. That has not been given out exactly where the president is going to go, what the timing of where he's going to be, how many places he's going to go. We do have reporters stationed in multiple spots of the Miami Valley, spots that were very much part of the storyline of Sunday morning's mass shooting down in the Oregon District. We have a reporter in the Oregon District. We have a couple of reporters at Miami Valley Hospital because there were patients that were taken there. We do have Ethan Fitzgerald also reporting from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Something to keep in mind too, if you are watching this. The president's motorcade, this is up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Fairborn, and he's visiting Dayton Mayor Nan Whaley. You saw her there. The full expectation is for him to be in Dayton at some point, though we do not have confirmation of exactly where and when. But the reason I bring that up is if you have anywhere that you are trying to go, keep in mind that the presidential motorcade shuts down highways. So keep that in mind as you are heading out, if you plan to over the next several hours. He is scheduled to leave Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We were told that a little bit earlier, that he is planning to leave around 12:15. Again, that's a very rough estimate. That could be moved slightly. But just keep that in mind, that if you're trying to travel anywhere on the major highways in and around downtown Dayton or around Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, you might encounter the motorcade, which means you're going to be coming to a full stop for a while.
You saw just a second ago, we had a picture-in-picture of some people gathering in the Oregon District. Again, we don't know exactly where the president is going to be. We have reporters at Miami Valley Hospital and in the Oregon District. You can see here, people are gathering. Some people have signs. Possibly in protest. So people are anticipating the president's arrival at some of these locations. Whether or not he actually makes it there, we don't know. Again, we're still just waiting for him to deplane, possibly make remarks to the media before he gets in the motorcade and goes to one of these likely one of these destinations, although, again, we can't know that for sure right now.
I do want to say this, and we're watching here on 2 News along with Lauren Wood. I'm John Seibel, waiting for the president to deplane. If there are any remarks that he gives, we will, of course, bring that to you. But before he got on the plane, I will say this, Lauren, we just showed that picture of people gathering in the Oregon District and wondering if he would go there and the remarks that he may make and some of the things that his critics want. He said this when asked about his critics. He said that many of his critics are political people that are trying to make points. He also said this about going to Dayton. We are going to Dayton first and then to El Paso. We will meet with some victims and first responders. We're going to take the opportunity to really congratulate the first responders. He also did mention, too, that he's had, this is a quote, many talks over the last few days and I think we are going to come up with something that's going to be really good. He's talking about referring to gun reform and other measures. Again, that's part of a news conference that we aim to be bringing to you shortly.
He also said background checks were important. That's something that he thinks are important. But when asked about assault rifles, he said there's no political appetite for that at this moment. He said, I will certainly bring this up. There is a great appetite, however, for background checks. So it looks like, at least from the White House, the conversation about gun reform is going to be centered on background checks. You heard from Sherrod Brown shortly after the shooting took place on Sunday that he wanted to get Congress back in session, wanted to get the House bill passed that would require universal background checks. Still not a lot of movement on that we've heard. So far, he said he was going to be pressuring Mitch McConnell to try and bring everybody back. But again, no progress that we know of has been made on that.
Yeah, and to that point about bringing the Senate back into session, President Trump says that he wouldn't bring them back until they were close, or he wouldn't call for them to come back until something was close. As you can see right here, the door has opened to Air Force One, awaiting the arrival of President Trump to come off that plane there, and First Lady Melania Trump is along as well. And after he comes down, we fully expect to see the greeting from various dignitaries, and there you see the president right now, along with the First Lady, exiting Air Force One.
Again, Dayton has obviously been on the president's radar since Sunday. He spoke at length about the situation here, talked about the fact that he would be directing any assistance needed. He said he would direct federal authorities on the ground to help out. And we have heard several times from the FBI and their involvement in the investigation here. The FBI specifically really looking into what kind of ideologies might have led to this shooting, talking about extremist ideologies, violent ideologies yesterday. That was one of the things that came out of the latest press conference with police and the FBI. And the president now on the ground. And you can see the motorcade there in the foreground.
Yeah, again, the president now being met by a host of dignitaries. We saw Governor Mike DeWine, his wife Fran was there. We saw Congressman Mike Turner, as you know, representative from right here in the Dayton area. We also saw Senator Sherrod Brown, who the president is speaking with right now, Mayor Nan Whaley, of course, and I think people are looking for to see what that conversation is like, because Mayor Nan Whaley, not mincing words yesterday, nor has she ever, when discussing some of the things that the president has said. And the rhetoric, as she calls it, that he has said. Matter of fact, yesterday she said, quote, of the president, his rhetoric has been painful for our community. And then when asked if she was going to share her thoughts, not only about that, but also about military-style weaponry that citizens have that she thinks should be banned. She was asked, would she share those points with the president? And she quickly said, of course, if I'm sharing it with you, I will share it with the president. So I think, Lauren, that would be an interesting conversation just to see from the outside, obviously, to hear as well.
And we know that they have had conversations. He's called Mayor Whaley on the phone. That was something that she confirmed for us early on after this happened, that the president did make contact with her. Mayor Whaley also encouraging people to make their voices heard to the president today. That was something that we heard in that press conference yesterday from Mayor Whaley when she was in the Oregon district, saying that people needed to make their voices heard. Let the president know what they think regarding gun control and potential legislation, what they want to see from the White House when it comes to action on this situation. Again, we know the president is focused on background checks right now. That was something that he said as he was leaving Washington this morning, headed for Dayton. And hopefully we'll get to hear some more about that if he does address the media. Those were the remarks that he was saying as he was leaving on the way here.
Interesting that when we were seeing that camera shot, and we'll take it back to the Oregon district here shortly, but as you mentioned, Lauren, that a group is gathering there at the memorial site. And there are several that are set up there in the Oregon district, but there you can see it over on the right side. Thank you for putting up that shot. And the last time there was a crowd gathering there would have been Sunday night. 8 o'clock at night for that vigil. And it was during that vigil that Governor Mike DeWine was drowned out from his remarks, which he was trying to express his sympathies, but he was drowned out by the chant of "Do something." It started from one individual in the crowd, and it grew to a chorus that drowned out the governor at one point. He said yesterday he understood their anger, adding that he and his wife, Fran, are also angry. And the call for do something yesterday, the governor said he was doing something when he then unveiled his plan. The question today is, what is the president prepared to do? Dayton City Commissioner Daryl Fairchild going as far when he released a statement yesterday saying, and I'm paraphrasing to the president, don't come unless you are going to do something. Don't bring empty words.
Obviously, that was heard by Mike DeWine. He outlined his proposed legislative reforms yesterday. Those include passing a red flag law that would allow the courts to issue safety protection orders to get guns out of the hands of people who are considered potentially dangerous. Red flag laws are something also that the president spoke about when he addressed the nation about the situation here in Dayton and in El Paso. He talked about reforming, the president that is, talked about reforming mental health laws to better identify mentally disturbed individuals who might commit acts of violence. He said, let's see here, this is actually what he was saying when he gave that speech about Dayton and El Paso. He said, mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun. So the president kind of giving his position on that.
As we see right there, we did see Senator Rob Portman walking by just a couple moments ago, and if you're curious who's writing and what, it's just a detail. I'm not intending to make anything of anything, just pointing out, observing what we saw. Governor Mike DeWine and his wife Fran getting into that car with President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump. We saw Mayor Nan Whaley, Senators Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown, as well as Congressman Mike Turner going to other vehicles as well. But in that vehicle right there with the President of the United States is the Governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, as you see them now pulling away from Air Force One.